Hello! This is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Correllian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don on Correllian TV, formerly Magic TV. And this is our first broadcast of Midday with Reverend Don on Correllian TV, and I want to thank you for joining us. And as you know, if you have followed Midday with Reverend Don on Pagan World TV, you can type your question or comment into whatever chat, whatever format you happen to be watching on, and it will show up in our chat room here. It will show on our right side on the screen, and we can talk directly. Today, I have rather a heavy subject to talk about, and I had not expected this for our first broadcast from Correllian TV. Um, but it came across my desk last night around 10 o'clock. And it is a subject of some concern, in my opinion. I think that you'll probably agree. It's certainly something that needs to be discussed. And um, we are planning a much larger report on this here at Correllian TV that will come um, within the next 24 hours or so. And we want to examine it in much greater depth. So I'm only going to remark upon the actual circumstance briefly in this broadcast, and then I want to talk in greater detail about the situation um, in general and the idea of the Satanic Panic. And those of you who are of a certain age will remember this term and may remember these events. But I think that for all of us in the pagan community, it's very important we not forget them and be mindful of them. So the story is this. There is a small, relatively unknown politician harassing a Correllian priestess um, on the Northeast coast on the idea that she is a Satanist. And this small politician is taking the idea that anyone who is not a Christian is a Satanist, and has specifically talked about Correllians, Wiccans, pagans, etc., specifically all being Satanists, all being devil worshippers, and appears to be trying to use this to bolster their political backing. And a number of people have pointed out that this is not a particularly formidable person at this moment. And this is certainly true. But the problem is that it's a formidable subject. And more than one minor politician has become a major politician by tapping onto this kind of subject. And I will point out, for those with really long memories, if you remember Senator McCarthy, before he got his communist in the State Department gimmick, he was considered a very insignificant figure, and he became a figure of national prominence. If we look at Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is known for obsession with conspiracy theories, how long ago was she nobody? But conspiracy theories made her somebody. And so tapping into this kind of conspiracy theory is potentially very powerful politically and potentially very dangerous to whoever is the subject matter of the conspiracy. And hello to Janet in the chat room. It's good to see you, Janet. So that's the story. We're working on a major report on the subject, so watch for that to come. And beyond that, I want to talk about why we cannot just ignore things like this. If you're of a certain age, which is not really much younger than me, you will remember the Satanic Panic, which came up, really kind of started in the 70s, but it got its wind in the 80s and early 90s. And this was a huge moral panic here in the US and some other parts of the world over the idea of organized Satanism and ritual abuse and all kinds of conspiracy theories on that subject. but led to a lot of chaos. And I want to say hello to Lynn in the chat room. And I want to say hello to Byron Ballard in the chat room. And Byron says, "Hi, Don. Talking to Mary Hawk about this." Yes, indeed. Um, as I say, we are putting together much more serious coverage of this situation because it's a serious situation. Um, so I say it came across my desk last night around 10, and it came from um, a different media source ultimately. Um, so the story is out there. And hello to Melanie Silver in the chat room. It's good to see you, Melanie. If you remember the Satanic Panic, there are a number of things that you should remember about it. The most important to me is the fact that many of the charges that were made and actually prosecuted were not physically possible. This was brought out uh, early in the situation. I remember seeing this brought up, I believe, to Lea D'Agostino, who was one of the district attorneys who was prosecuting a Satanic Panic case, that the accusations were not things that could physically have happened. Why was she prosecuting it? And she blew the whole thing off and said, and basically said, "We're just prosecuting it." The fact that something is not reasonable, the fact that it perhaps is not possible, the fact that any reasonable person with a relative education would know better is not necessarily a protection. One of the most important of those Satanic Panic cases involving a preschool was started by a woman who was a diagnosed schizophrenic and hallucinatory. And this was known, and yet her accusations were taken seriously. Although, again, it's debatable whether they were even possible. But people wanted to believe it, and therefore they did. It met a social need that they have. Now, if we look at politics today, we see an awful lot of this going on. If you look at the book banning movement, if you look at the anti-drag movement, if you look at a number um, of social panic movements going on, they don't really make any sense. In many cases, they're obviously purely emotional in where they're coming from and not really dealing with what's actually happening, but that isn't stopping them. When we talk about things like the Satanic Panic, we need to remember that common sense may be something we want to point out, but it's not necessarily going to help. Hello to Rev Michael in the chat room. Now, does that necessarily mean this little story is going to start up the Satanic Panic again? Well, not necessarily. But there's no reason to think it could not. Um, because if you look at what started it the first time, it was not things that you would have expected people to pay any attention to. If you look at the book banning movement, who would have thought anyone would be paying attention to the kind of people pushing this? Um, if you look at some of the other things going on among conspiracy theorists in this country, if you look at some of the conspiracy theories, how can anyone believe them? And yet they do. And people who have been part of that movement and then come back from it have, in many cases, said they were kind of overcome by the emotion of the situation. Um, and I'm receiving messages about the story. Pardon me for checking my phone, but it's a happening story. But as we look at these people, common sense is not really a factor. If you look at the way they pursue some of these situations, neither common sense nor decency are necessarily factors. If you look at some of the cases that have been very heavily in the news lately, they involve false accusations against people who were doing nothing wrong and had their lives disrupted for years because some fringe politician, and in some cases not fringe politicians, found it helpful to their cause to accuse them of something they had not done. And all this time later, they're winning court cases against those politicians. But how much does that really help them? it certainly does not correct the things that have happened in the meantime. It might help them in the future. This kind of story can be hugely damaging to a person. And hello to Zayla from Dublin, Ireland. It's good to see you. Um, we need as a community to be mindful there are people who want to start this up again. And we need to be mindful of making sure they can't. We need to be thoughtful about our responses. We need to be proactive. And as I so commonly say, we must be in charge of our own image. We cannot allow them to guide how people see us. We must do everything in our power to help people to see us accurately, or it will be partly our own fault when people don't. And Zayla says, I don't follow politics at all. A lot of people take that point of view, but that doesn't mean politics may not be following you. Um, I was mentioning that court case. Well, one of several court cases recently about people who have won major um, cases against conspiracy theorists who accuse them of sometimes quite outrageous things, who were probably not all that terribly political before this happened to them. Thinking about, for example, the Sandy Hook parents. Um, they found themselves deeply involved in conspiracy theories and politics through absolutely no fault of their own and no way to avoid it. Um, and so I think that as a community, and not necessarily, I'm not necessarily speaking to every individual, I'm speaking to the community. I'm speaking to the people in a position to do something. But I think I would also say to everyone, don't just ignore it. It may not ignore us. Now, in the Satanic Panic, and I was talking about the Satanic Panic and have set that as my subject for today, and I am old enough to remember the Satanic Panic, and I know our community, the Wiccan community, the pagan community, were very worried about being targeted during that period. And for the most part, we were not. The reason we were not is that civil rights leaders like Selena Fox, to name one, Pete Pathfinder Davis, to name another, were extremely proactive in educating the public about who we were and who we were not. Back in that day, oh, and hello to Reverend Melanie in the chat room. It's good to see you, Reverend Melanie. We were able to distance ourselves from the conspiracy theories, fantasy, satanic community because we were clearly not those same people. I don't know that we would be successful doing that this time. And the important thing about this particular story is that the conspiracy theorist politician in question knows perfectly well um, that they are talking about Correllians, Wiccans, pagans, um, but still insists that we're all Satanists. There is no way to educate against that point of view because it is a willful ignorance. That's what makes this so particularly concerning. It is a very potentially dangerous point of view if it becomes a common conspiracy theory point of view. And now, at a certain level, it's been a common conspiracy theory point of view for decades. But it's been a long time since it's been in the forefront. And we as a community, I think, need to do everything in our power to make sure it does not return to that format, to that forefront. Um, because, these situations are dangerous in a number of ways. They're dangerous politically, they're potentially dangerous to our political rights. I've often talked about the Helms Amendment, which was an amendment during the time of the Satanic Panic intended to remove civil rights from any religious organization that acknowledged religious witchcraft as part of its path. Um, and that was a potentially very deeply threatening movement. Now, it was defeated, and it was defeated in part due to those civil rights leaders I mentioned and their proactively involving themselves with it, with education, and the fact that they presented themselves in very reasonable, very understandable ways, and were able to overcome the conspiracy theories that were attempting to move against them. And the fact that at that time, the US Congress had far fewer conspiracy theory minded people in it. I don't know that that would work given some of the people in Congress today who often seem to be looking only for that next headline and are not particularly concerned with the reasonableness of their positions. And I think we need to be mindful here in the US, and I am primarily at this moment talking about US situations. We need to be mindful that it's a different time in which far less reasonable positions are flying quite high. Um, and hello to Brenda in the chat room. Another case that we saw. Hello to Calvin in the chat room. Good to see you, Calvin. Another situation that we often remark upon in this kind of situation was the West Memphis Three. This was a group of three young Wiccans who found themselves um, falsely accused of a horrible crime, mostly just because of their religion. And later, this became quite clear. Um, Now, hello to Brian in the chat room. Brian says, in New York State, this teacher should be filing a complaint either with the New York State Division of Human Rights. Um, yes, I hope that they are doing that. And hello to James from North Carolina. It's good to see you, James. And hello to Renee. It's good to see you, Renee. But no, this is another case of someone, the West Memphis Three, whose civil rights were severely damaged because of local prejudice and conspiracy theories. Um, and Reverend Melanie says, I reached out to multiple pagan media outlets regarding this person and his claims. I will not stay quiet. And yet, quiet is not good, in my opinion. Um, I've talked about that early event that influenced my attitudes, where it was one of the early pagan spirit gatherings, and they had a large number of protesters come out and threaten them with violence. And the vast majority of people ran to hide in the woods, leaving just a handful of organizers to deal with it. I've always taken the point of view that this was not the right thing to do, although it did work out on that occasion. But hiding in the woods basically means that you're alone in the woods. Um, and if that handful of organizers can't handle it, well, you're alone in the woods. What are you going to do? We need to take advantage of our numbers. We need to have solidarity. We need to stand together because being alone in the woods is not a good place to be. We all have heard stories of people who have faced personal attack um, and um, various other forms of local persecution because of their religion. The fact that theoretically this should not be happening doesn't mean it can't. Now, one of the things that we have worked on in recent years was the Order of Paladins. I would hope that the Order of Paladins at this moment are preparing emergency plans for this situation because this is exactly the kind of thing that they were formed to deal with. Um, and if it were to go badly, it's exactly the sort of thing they would be of help with. So I hope that they are mindful of this, and because people may end up needing help, it's possible. it certainly, at this moment, um, I don't know that anyone is in need of any kind of physical help, and maybe they won't be. But we don't wait um, until the need is there to start thinking about what we could do. And Reverend Melanie says he attacked a teacher and continued to call out others, including myself. And I am in talks with legal as well. Yes, and the person involved in this situation, who was the main subject of the attack, is a teacher, which is part of what makes it such a potentially explosive situation. People often act far less rationally in situations involving the school system. And if we go back to those book bannings, um, one of the things that gave them so much um, strength was that they were working within the school system, not the wider society. But then it jumps over into the wider society. The fact that things like this don't stay small is one of the things we need to be mindful of. And yes, maybe this one will. With any luck, it will. But on the other hand, as I say, it came across my desk last night from wider um, press forces. It was not brought to me by anyone involved in it. Um, and hello to Rebecca in the chat room. Rebecca says, I'm watching on my break at work. Many people do that. And thank you for doing this. Thank you, Rebecca. So I say, this is not what I plan to talk about on our first Correllian TV Midday with Reverend Don. Actually, I think this is our first actual Correllian TV anything since changing from Magic TV. Um, but I can't imagine anything more important to do it on either. Having lived through the Satanic Panic, um, I am extremely mindful of how this can go off the rails. And, if you're a younger person, you may not have an understanding of that because in your lifetime, we have been successful in keeping things from going off the rails. And we may be quite successful in keeping this from going off the rails, or we might not. And hello to Rita in the chat room. It's good to see you, Rita. And Rita says, blessed be, Rita. Now, tomorrow, I'm going to have a very different subject. Tomorrow is the 45th anniversary of my becoming first priest of the Correllian tradition. Of course, I'm now retired in office. Still one of the first priesthood, but retired in office. But I want to talk about that tomorrow. And the next day, we'll be talking about Correllian Press. But today, we're talking about this. And as I say, we're putting together some more detailed reports about the actual story unfolding now. But today, I'm talking more generally about how these things can overtake unsuspecting people. I mentioned the West Memphis Three. How long were their lives disrupted, if in fact they're not disrupted now, even once everything is concluded? They certainly can't ever put them back where they were. There are still people sitting in jail from Satanic Panic convictions that everyone now admits were false, but they pled guilty to try to get a lighter sentence, and so they cannot get anyone to acknowledge that they made a false plea. They're stuck with it. People who maintain their innocence mostly have at some point received redress, but what does that matter when you consider what it did in their lives? Some people died before they can get redress from Satanic Panic situations. Um, and one of the points that I want to make is that there was no large organized satanic ritual abuse organization in this country or anywhere when the Satanic Panic was running or today. It is a social panic, it is a mythology that didn't stop it. The people who were accused during the Satanic Panic, for the most part, had nothing to do with anything metaphysical, satanic or otherwise. Most of them, in fact, quite a large number of them, were involved in one way or another with Christian churches. Um, the one that I particularly remember was a man named Dale Akiki, and you can look him up for yourself. And this gentleman, mainly, I think, became a victim of this kind of satanic panic accusation because he had certain physical disfigurements, which, as you know, often causes people to be treated abusively. But he ended up being accused of all sorts of bizarre things. And the story that I remember, the minister of the church was sitting in the courtroom listening to the testimony, and up until that point had backed the accusers until they said, and the prosecution actually was pushing the idea that Dale Akiki had brought an elephant, an actual live full-sized elephant, into this church, sacrificed it on the altar, and had everything cleaned up by 5 p.m. For other people to come in and do their normal church things, and left no residue that could be found. And the minister said, at that point, I knew this was a lie. Nobody could have done something like that and cleaned it up that quickly. And of course, obviously, even where forensics were then, you couldn't have gotten rid of the bloodstains. It was clearly not true, but there was the prosecution acting on the part of the state, pursuing these charges anyway, even though that could not have been done. Not to mention, no elephants were missing anywhere. There aren't that many elephants in the United States. They're not native here. You would think if there was a local elephant missing, someone would have said something. Someone would have noticed. Or, for that matter, in this church, which was in a residential area with lots of people, someone might have noticed the elephant being taken into the church. But no, none of that happened, and yet it went forward. That's why we have to be so vigilant about this. That's why we must be so mindful about it, because it does not matter if it does not make sense. It does not matter if it's not physically possible. If those who want to make hay out of it choose to do so, they will simply ignore those things and have done so before. Therefore, we must not ignore these things and must take the most reasonable and sensible actions that we can. What are those actions? Number one, making sure that we represent ourselves and that we take a proactive stance and a proactive position in situations like this when they arise. It is, and Mala, hello to Mala in the chat room. Mala makes the comment, considering how corrupt the police have become, I'm not surprised. Well, in certain places, that is something that has been an issue. And I don't see a way to look at the Satanic Panic and not see it as corruption, because the prosecutors who brought these cases in many cases had to deliberately ignore the fact that the situations physically could not have happened. And that to me seems pretty corrupt. And Rev Melanie says fear will always blind. And this is true. But I don't think it's fear, it's power. Because why did these DAs go ahead and press these cases? Because they had higher political ambitions and it sped them on to them. One of these was Janet Reno, who eventually became the Attorney General, largely on the basis of things she had done during the Satanic Panic. It is, Calvin says, never underestimate the power of politics. That's exactly what I'm saying. We must be mindful that just because this is nonsense, just because it's a conspiracy theory, does not mean it's not useful to certain people, and we must do our best to make sure it's not, in fact, useful to them. So that's all of our half hour for today. I'm not going to say it's all I have to say about it, but it's all I'm going to fit into this half hour. Um, and watch for us to bring more information on this later today and tomorrow. We have our reporters, including Reverend Mary Hawk, working on putting together stories about this as we speak, so that uh, we can be proactive in our stance. I want to thank you for watching. This is our first broadcast from Correllian TV as such, formerly Magic TV, and our first Midday with Rev Don from Correllian TV. I will see you tomorrow, and until next time, um, I hope that you have a wonderful day, and let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you to help us to protect our community and ourselves from those who would do us harm. Help us to be proactive and successful in dealing with those who would challenge our rights and endanger our lives and our liberties. Help us to be strong and to be brave when bravery is necessary. And help us to put forward our best foot and our truest image in the world. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you. We know you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. May you be blessed now and always. And again, I will see you tomorrow, and stay tuned to Correllian TV for more on this breaking story.